Yes, I see that you're commemorating Lent today,
Yes,
Ash Wednesday.
I've kitted up for Ash Wednesday, so I have the ashes.
Mm. Well, I think people in Britain have forgotten all about Ash Wednesday. The big thing in Britain now is Ramadan, which is apparently when the Muslims don't eat lunch, and the
Well,
world
yeah, no,
gets to find out about it.
it's interesting because I was just talking to some Muslim friends about this year is, well, I mean, for the past number of years, in fact, there's been a crossover with Lent and Ramadan because Ramadan moves. It goes by the lunar calendar. And, Easter also moves. So, I mean, so that our liturgical, we're moving in various concentric directions. But for the past few years, the fasting seasons have kind of overlapped for us. So, we have Lent, of course, as the fasting season for Christians. And yes, Ramadan is, the fasting season for Muslims, and which they will not eat or drink from sunrise to sunset, essentially. When the sun is in the sky, they don't eat or drink. And so that is their tradition with that. And so we have Muslim friends and I do have a kind of teasing with each other. We're like, well, we'll keep each other accountable to try and do the fasting, on our specific fast days. Because, of course, Lent is not as strict nowadays as Ramadan. But back in the day, like in the medieval period, it was much closer to the way Muslims practice Ramadan in terms of really giving up lots and lots of different types of food throughout the Lenten season. So it was closer, it was more rigorous. But now we still do have, the fast days, and this is one of the fast days as far as Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So it's it's basically supposed to be the idea of fasting, both certainly from a Christian point of view, but also Muslims with regards to Ramadan. It is supposed to be like a spiritual purge. So you're kind of training your body to basically go without so that you can focus on the higher goods and put things into perspective.
Yes, it's I like the idea, and somebody introduced me to the idea of going without a few years ago, and I quite liked the idea. And also, if I was being honest about it, I thought it was a good idea for a diet as well. So I'm actually for the last 3 years, actually, I've cut out alcohol for 40 days and 40 nights.
Oh, really?
And this year I'm cutting out alcohol and bread. Can you believe it?
Oh, really?
That's
that's admirable. You see, and this is something. I mean, this was like a thing again in the Middle Ages. They would cut out leaven, for example, and you still can run into that type of thing with some observations in the Orthodox communities and Eastern Rite traditions. So you're going into Slavic mode.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hoping to drop a few pounds as well. That would be a bonus, because that's really what puts on the beef is alcohol and bread, or the 3 B's as I call it: beer, bakeries, and bread.
Beer, bakeries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No, I could definitely see that.
Yes. Anyway, let's talk about what you're on here tonight about, and that's basically for the 5th installment of what I like to call Scottish Loyalists in the American Revolution, or the American Rebellion, depending which side of that particular conflict you're on. And the people we've looked at previously: Major John Pitcairn, General Simon Fraser, Major Patrick Ferguson, and General Edward Braddock. And tonight we're going to be hearing about General John Forbes. Now, tell us, what period of time are we talking? What's the years here, and what's the geography of this particular man's situation?
So General Forbes is mainly known for his participation in the 7 Years' War, alias the French and Indian War. So it's the same conflict, though in Europe it tends to be called the 7 Years' War. It's the wider theater, whereas the war specifically in North America is called the French and Indian War. So Forbes' story and his participation in that war ties in a lot to the previous gentleman that I discussed, which was General Edward Braddock, because where Braddock failed, Forbes succeeded, essentially, in terms of the campaign both of them embarked upon. One attempt at Braddock's campaign was an attempt to take the French Fort Duquesne, and it failed. And Forbes' expedition was an attempt to take Fort Duquesne, and it succeeded. So they are connected that way. But to begin at the beginning with Forbes, he was born in Dunfermline in Scotland, a very famous area for its connection to King Malcolm and Queen St. Margaret of Scotland and the abbey that was founded there. And he comes from this very prominent family, the Forbes, in terms of politics and law and the military. They're very prominent. He has a lot of prominent relatives who are involved in various facets of Scottish and then British society. He has relatives who were involved in the passing of the Act of Union, for example. He also has relatives who distinguished themselves as agents of the government. They tended to be a pro-government family. In terms of more specific, they tended to be pro-Hanoverian government, like during the Jacobite rebellions and so forth, and they tended to be pro-Union, pro-Whig, prior to that during the reign of Queen Anne and so forth. So Forbes' cousin, so John Forbes' cousin, Duncan Forbes of Culloden, is actually fairly famous as well in his own right, and he could have a whole different episode, but he was, a very famous government agent, legal mind, religious author, a bit of an Enlightenment man, a jack of all trades within the Scottish sphere. So John comes from this very prestigious family. Now, his father dies a few months before he was born, actually, and it comes from a big family, and with quite a few siblings. And at first, his intention is to go into medicine. So he studies medicine in Edinburgh, but then he ends up shifting and instead going into the military. So as a young man, he goes into the military. He was often in and out of financial difficulties, which was common when you went into the military at this time. There was struggles in order to pay for your commission, and then all of these basically payments that went into accoutrements and everything else. So he struggled financially quite a bit in his early years, especially. But he ends up in the War of Austrian Succession. So this is basically in the 1740s. It's concentric with the Second Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 is basically going on in conjunction in a lot of ways with the war that was happening, the War of Austrian Succession. And so he ends up in that war in Belgium, fighting, in the British Armed Forces. And he is an aide-de-camp of General James Campbell, another Scot. And Campbell gets mortally wounded in battle when on the continent. And Forbes, his aide, refuses to leave him when the army is forced into retreat. He won't leave his commander, who's badly wounded. And he stays, and he gets captured along with him by the French. And he's pretty quickly exchanged out, although his commander dies. And he is clearly, from his letters, very bereft of his commander. He really cared about him and saw him as a mentoring figure. And it was kind of a moment that does go to show Forbes' character, though, that he has a great sense of loyalty to his commander as an aide, and he was willing to, stay and take whatever risks with him being captured by the enemy. So this is a moment with him that is quite memorable. And over time, Forbes just progresses with his career in the military in various capacities in various locations, and eventually it leads up to where he gets more famous. He has been networking quite a lot. Again, in military circles, he has a lot of different connections. He, like the vast majority of other British officers in the 18th century, is a part of the Freemasons. This was especially common in Scotland. And so he has those kind of military connections that are built off of that association. And so eventually he ends up in the French and Indian War. So this is in the 1750s. So just to scroll back to what I talked about last time, General Braddock's march and the massacre, the Battle of Monongahela, took place in 1755. It was such a disaster that they really didn't, wholeheartely try again for a number of years until basically they ultimately get it in 58. So there's time that spanned between the two attempts. And so Braddock was in charge of the last one. Forbes is in charge of this one. And Forbes comes into this as he's starting to experience really poor health. It's kind of a bit of an irony given he was a doctor, or he wasn't a doctor. He was studying medicine and he wanted to be a doctor. So he ends up dealing with really terrible health, which to this day we're not exactly sure what was wrong with him. Some debate that it could have been stomach cancer or something to that effect, but it took a massive toll on his just energy, sapped his strength, and yet he was out there and he was determined to press on with the campaign. And so he ends up, and this ties into the young George Washington. So from the last episode, I'd mentioned that he was an aide to General Braddock on that Braddock's March Monongahela experience.
That's right. Just for the benefit of the listeners as well, that was when George Washington was actually on the British side.
Yes.
Rather than later in his career when, of course, circumstances changed to the point where he chose the winning side. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So this is young George Washington in his 20s. He's very zealously royalist. And he's very eager to attain a British military commission. And this becomes part of his grievance, is that, there were all types of prejudices in the time period based on everything you can think of, ranging from, race to religion to location. It's just the way it is. So he, as a colonial, was in a position where it would be very difficult to get a regular army commission. And he knew that, but he kind of kept hoping that if he made the right connections and sort of befriended the right people and proved himself enough, he could get what he wanted and get this commission and excel the way that he wanted to excel in the British regular force. So in the aftermath, if you recall, with Braddock, Braddock had got him off the bench in the beginning because Washington had basically opened fire on a French ambassadorial delegation. He didn't realize they were ambassadors, but it turned out they were. And then he lost control of his Indian allies, who ended up killing the ambassador, and kind of mayhem unfolded. And he ended up building a fort in a valley called Fort Necessity, which basically got taken down. And it was really, really bad in terms of on his record, and therefore he was put on the bench. And so Braddock basically gives him the opportunity to get off of the bench and become his aide. And Braddock actually pushed back on royal governors who didn't want Washington being involved. So Braddock helped get him off the bench. And so then he, of course, Okay,
so Forbes.
Get to the Forbes. So he ends up with... So the whole Braddock thing happens, and so the end of it was that Braddock hadn't listened to Washington, just to recap, about wilderness tactics. And so Washington had a bit of a grind toward Braddock's memory due to this. They had kind of ended on some complicated footing, let's just put it that way. And then later on, Washington goes to Lord Loudon, another figure who is Scottish, and tries to get advancement, essentially, in the aftermath of the Monongahela situation. And Loudon is pretty rude to him. So if I say he's pretty pompous and pretty rude to Washington. So Washington kind of does a walkout sort of does that. I protest, I walk out, I'm not going to be involved. Like, I'm going to quit the army, essentially. Even the, like, colonial position he had in the colonial militias. So Forbes hears about this, as we're roping into Forbes. Forbes hears about this, and he says, well, I hear that the kid has some skill. This is kind of almost mirroring what happened with Braddock a little bit. He says, I hear the kid has some skill, and it would be a shame to see him go. And then he asks somebody, why don't you invite him onto my campaign? Why don't you invite him onto my expedition? And so this happens. And so Washington starts out being very enthused about this, actually. And he thinks that, well, now he's got somebody who's more receptive than Loudon. And so he writes this very gushy message directly to Forbes, really aggrandizing him and praising him and so forth. The thing is that Forbes famously didn't like to be overly complimented. He was kind of a down-to-earth guy who didn't like flattery, or what he perceived to be flattery. So they got off on a little funny footing there. And then things kind of got worse because this comes to what Forbes is famous for, Forbes Road, something that still is a thing in Pennsylvania. And so basically Forbes wanted to build a road because of, necessity in a way, in terms of trying to get them to where they needed to go. They needed a better road system, he was saying. We need a better road system. We need to be able to take them the way I want to take them in this campaign. We need to build a road. Problem was, you had civilian road building companies, essentially, under different colonial governance, scrapping with each other for who's going to build the road. Forbes gets fed up with them all and essentially is like, no, the army will build the road. This caused some more problems because some people said it was military overreach. It's something that's still debated to this day, especially because Forbes, like, to be fair, all commanders in doing anything like this, used forage and used conscription, and red tape hung up the pay for the conscripts. It wasn't really all his fault. It was just red tape. But suffice to say, people, some of them felt it was high-handed, some of them felt it was forceful, but Forbes, he felt it was necessary. He says, I'm a career man. I'm a military guy. I know what needs to happen in order for us to take this fort. We need this road, and I can't go back and forth with everybody over this. Okay. So, yeah, Washington is not happy with this because he and his family had invested in one of the road companies, the civilian road companies. So they begin to clash. Washington on this expedition with Forbes, they start to clash. So what essentially happens is that Washington is also going through some trauma from Monongahela. So he's starting to feel like this plan is too similar to that. I don't like it, and I don't like this road thing. So what he ends up doing is communicating, writing letters to some other young officers in the regular army, and in the British regular army now, and some of them even on Forbes' staff, and kind of trying to go behind Forbes' back to write the king. So this is now King George II. And to write him and to essentially say Forbes is too ill to do this project. Forbes, his physical ailments are affecting his mind, and he's not making clear judgments. So he wanted to kind of do this sort of type conspiracy with some of the young officers and so forth. Well, it turns out Forbes finds out about it through one of the officers. He gets wind of the situation, which doesn't help their relationship much. And he ends up sort of sending Washington into a form of Boondocks exile, so to speak, to kind of put some space between them. He's still on the campaign, but there's some space between them. And so there's some bad blood, and Washington will always maintain that he was treated unjustly, whereas Forbes just feels like he was defending himself. So that's yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we've only got 5 minutes left, but
going forward. So basically, Forbes continues with his road. So this is the point that he makes the call, and he's saying we need this road. He compromises a bit with the civilian authorities by saying, okay, look, I'll do less of the road than I originally intended to do. I'll use part of Braddock's road, and then I'll do part of my road. We'll compromise, sort of. So one of the things that, just to switch to Forbes as a person, he had a great deal of determination under intense stress. And also a wonderful sense of humor. He had a very sarcastic sense of humor, even under great, again, strain and stress. And you can read it in his letters and so forth. And he also had a wonderful way of being charismatic, to try to get people to stick with this project despite everything, all of the setbacks, terrible weather, again, his health, everything going wrong. So I'm just going to read briefly some bits and pieces about.
Do you want to tell us? Did he meet his maker eventually in combat, or
yes.
did he die of an old age? Because we'll need to ramp this up.
Yes, I know. And this is very short quote. Okay, but anyway, yeah. So what he ends up doing is he makes it, despite all odds, he gets to Fort Duquesne. He makes it on the road. And the French, once he approaches, blow up the fort and evacuate it. So they take it, and Fort Duquesne becomes Fort Pitt, which becomes the origin point of Pittsburgh, the city in Pennsylvania. So Forbes very shortly afterwards dies of his ailments. So he's one of the first Scots that we've talked about who has not been shot, but he does die of his ailments. So that's what happens there. He patches it up a little bit with Washington toward the end, because Washington felt a bit bad and wrote him essentially. And Forbes says, "You are threatening to come visit me. If you come visit me, I will see you." And so they have this little patch up. But so anyway, so wrapping that up, and then this, Can
you tell us what's this picture? What's happening in this picture there?
That's the fort being blown up, and he's in a stretcher, because he had to be carried in a stretcher for much of the campaign. And so that is Fort Duquesne. He's writing basically back to report that the fort has finally been taken, and all of the sacrifices made and all of the deaths that were incurred on Braddock's march and his own have meant something. Britain has taken the fort, the Union Jack has been raised. So that's essentially what's going on there. And then in very brief, these are just a few excerpts either from Forbes. So this is from Forbes to his men. This is a rousing speech that he gave to try to keep them going with it, really. It says, and he talks about himself in third person with it. "The general, therefore, with great confidence, depends upon the men's alacrity and steadiness in carrying on the rest of the service, that we may show our enemies the danger of rousing Britons fired and animated with love of their king and country." And the next bit is something from a chaplain who was talking about when Forbes was brought in to see his men after he'd been carried by stretcher. And there was a great satisfaction and pleasure appeared in his countenance upon finding himself at Raystown with his troops. The roads were crowded with people to see him, whom he saluted with a smile as he passed along, and they in their turn discovered a secret joy upon seeing him. And so then he goes to dinner with him, and he says he's, in spite of being very, very ill, he puts on a face, invites him to dinner, and says, you know, he is very facetious and in high spirits at table, though extremely weak and in low health. And he inquired much into the moral state of the army and declared he was concerned at not being able to attend divine service. He was basically a pious Presbyterian, much like his cousin Duncan Forbes. This was this is honestly maybe a summation of it. John Forbes was a man very dedicated to duty. He had a simple but a strong sense of duty to his country, to his king, to his God. And that was what really formed his life. And then this is the very end, which is his obituary. And it says of him, "He made a willing sacrifice of his life to what he valued more, the interest of his king and country. As a man, he was just and without prejudices, brave without ostentation, uncommonly warm in friendship and incapable of flattery, acquainted with the world and mankind. He was well bred, but absolutely impatient of formality and affectation. Eminently possessed of the sociable virtues, he indulged a cheerful gratification, but quick in his sense of honor and duty, so mixed the agreeable gentleman and the man of business together as to shine alike in both characters, without the giddiness sometimes attendant on the one or the sourness of the other." So that is the obituary, and yeah, in a way, I guess I would say that. Ironically, I would say his story does kind of fit in Ash Wednesday context, because it is kind of a memento mori story that, you know, in spite of dealing with a mortal illness, he remained true to his, again, obligations, true to his duties, true to his faith. And I mean, that's, I think, a good way to live and indeed seal your life.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a kind of common theme running among all the soldiers that you have highlighted
Hmm.
from Scotland is this sense of duty,
Oh yes.
sense of loyalty to the king, sense of responsibility to the troops,
Hmm.
all of that sort of thing, very, very strongly held, certainly back then when the world was
Well, the
different,
world was more
different in many
aware
ways.
in a way. It was more
Yeah,
aware of fundamentals, I think, the fundamentals of what made a hero. To be honest, a
yes,
hero is one who
yes,
sacrifices of themselves.
yes. Well, you have written a book, a kind
I
of
have.
historical fiction around around the themes that animate you. It's called All Ye That Pass By. And anybody who's interested in historical fiction,
Yes.
is all you need to do is search Amazon for All Ye
Hmm.
That Pass By,
Yes.
and you'll get that.
Those interested in 18th century British military figures from both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution probably find it interesting because a lot of them do feature in it, and it's the first book of a trilogy. So working on the other two gradually,
Good. Well,
gradually, like Forbes on his road.
yes, absolutely. Avellina, it's the top of the hour. Thanks very much for coming in,
Oh,
and
thank you
thanks
so
very
much,
much
Alistair.
for that very comprehensive, I should say, description of the man, from birth to death.
Yeah.
And what's important for us is that it that people know that such people exist,
Hmm.
because today American history is really just held, post-revolutionary period. But of course,
Hmm.
there was a whole time of British America,
Oh,
which
absolutely.
was prior to then, and the
And it's still in
unfortunate.
our cultural bloodstream, is absolutely still in our cultural bloodstream. I've said it in the past, but when I talk about these figures, I don't consider it as talking about foreigners. I consider it talking about we were all one people at one point.
Yes,
And that's
yes,
something that is important to remember. So these people are just as much a part of my heritage as yours.
absolutely,
Mhm.
100%. What a great attitude you've got there, Avellina. Good. Well, no doubt you'll find another person, and when you do, uh,
I'll do
tell
Sir
us,
Peter
and we'll have
Halkett
you.
because he's in both. I'll do the Halketts, the Halkett family. They're in both campaigns, Braddock and Forbes. I'll do them next time.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll be happy to hear it anytime. Good. So it just remains for me to say all the best to you on
Thank
this
you.
Ash
Have a blessed
Wednesday.
Lent.